Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. During the nearly 3,000 years since the Buddha lived, his teachings have spread widely around the globe. In each culture where Buddhism was introduced, the teachings were pruned and modified to harmonize with local customs, laws, and cultures. Today's guest has written a book that explores the fundamental teachings of the Buddha and show how they can be applied to contemporary daily life in the modern West. Our guest is Peter Coyote, author of Zen in the Vernacular, Things as It Is. Peter is an award-winning actor, author, director, screenwriter, and narrator who has worked with some of the world's most distinguished filmmakers. Recognized for his narration work, and I think he's probably got one of the most familiar voices on earth. He narrated the PBS series The Pacific Century, winning an Emmy Award, as well as 8 Ken Burns documentaries, including The Roosevelts, for which he won a second Emmy. In 2011, he was ordained a Zen Buddhist priest, and in 2015 received transmission from his teacher, making him an independent Zen teacher. The author of several books, he lives in Northern California. Hello, Peter, and welcome to the
Hi, Paul. Thanks. It's 15 shows for Ken Burns.
Wow.
I need to update that bio.
I guess so. You know, I actually had the darshan of Suzuki. So, I found your book just a delightful read. But how did you choose the title, Zen in the Vernacular, Things as It Is?
Well, I was trained at San Francisco Zen Center, which was started by Suzuki Roshi.
Right.
And Zen is a Japanese form of Buddhism, came from Chan in China.
Yeah.
But Buddha wasn't Japanese. Buddha was born in Nepal, and he was born in a Hindu culture. And so everywhere he went, he would, or Buddhists would kind of adjust so they didn't offend local customs or local beliefs. They wanted to transmit these insights about dependent origination, about everything being dependent on everything else, and the Four Noble Truths. And at a certain point in Zen Center, which I loved and which changed me more than anything has in my life, it began to bother me that the culture was so Japanese oriented. We all used Japanese names. We dressed like Japanese people. And I knew a lot about Japanese people. My father was the first Caucasian who was awarded beginner's level as a professional Go player. And he was a member of the Nippon Club in New York. And Japanese people are very emotional, and they get drunk and they party, and they're very interesting people. And I began to notice how everything in Buddhist places that I visited, people were afraid of strong feelings. They were afraid to be impulsive. They were watching themselves so closely that it seemed to be crushing a certain kind of human spirit. And I just started thinking, well, most people are not going to shave their heads or wear robes or live a monastic life. Most Buddhists in America are secular. And I thought I'd like to take a shot at loosening the gift wrapping, the Japanese gift wrapping. I didn't want to get rid of it. That's the way that I was taught. I love my little tatami mat studio. I like my robes when they're appropriate. But I wanted to loosen it so that Americans would know these are human states. I've met machinists who've disappeared into their work and, gotten around the edge of their ego. I've known women who've disappeared into their knitting or lace making. And I thought, okay, maybe if I can just make people see that Buddha understood humanity, and there's nothing really inherently foreign about this, and it's very, very useful. And if we take vows to save all beings, well, let's include Americans and let's try to make it a little more American. So that's what I did.
Yeah. So you state that you thought the secular spiritual life might be the appropriate vantage point for you, but yet you became ordained as a Zen priest. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I did. So my teacher asked me to take this 3 year Zen priest training, and I did that. And I was so impressed by the caliber of the people that I was working with. They were far advanced of me. They were running groups and teaching, and I just wanted to up my game. So I asked him if he'd ordain me. And the thing about being a priest is it's a calling. Some places you go and people spend enough time in a monastery, they expect to be promoted to a priest. But priests are an odd lot of people. They're people who are sort of dedicated to service, and I'm that way. So that didn't bother me at all. And then in another couple of years, he transmitted me, which is, they stick a meat thermometer in you and they say you're done. And he gives me his authority to ordain my own priests and to transmit my own successor, and I become a part of the lineage.
Right.
Um, my teacher's Sangha, the group of people that study Buddhism, was called Vimala Sangha. And it was named after a guy, Vimalakirti, who was reputedly just behind the Buddha in his insight. But he was a layman. He was a wealthy man. He had servants, he had properties, and he would preach the Dharma at the racetrack, in the bars, anywhere he was. And every Zen temple in Japan has a picture of Vimalakirti with a full head of hair. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of my model. We don't know if he actually existed or not, but it was a perfect expression of what's called Mahayana Zen, meaning the big vehicle. Anybody can be included. And so that just seems kind of appropriate to America, to me.
Yeah. Okay. Now the most famous book that Suzuki wrote, as far as I know, was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And I think, can you kind of translate that for us?
Yeah, well, I recorded the audiobook of it.
Wow. So I get familiar with it.
Well, what he said in a nutshell is, in the mind of an expert, there are very few possibilities.
Right.
But in the mind of a beginner, everything's wide open. You watch kids playing with blocks. They pound them, they click them together, they make things, they knock them over. They have no limits. And the older you get, you start building good structures. It's like sand castles, you can make them as elaborate as you want. And so that book is a series of lectures by an outstanding Zen master. And the phrase on the title of my book, called Things as It Is, was his phrase. And when I first heard it, I thought, oh, isn't this charming? His English is not really good. So, things as it is. It's not grammatical. It should be things as they are.
Right.
But when I got a little older, I realized how shrewd it was, because things stand for the plurality of the world. Right. The apparent difference between you and me and the trees and the birds and anything that can be named. But in actuality, because everything is interdependent, there's only one it. So things as it is tells us that there are two ways of looking at things. You can look at it as the plurality, or you can look at it as the singularity, but you got to do both.
Right.
I'll read you a.
There's so many quotes. There's a few quotes by Suzuki Roshi in the book I really love, like, "You are perfect just the way you are, and you could use a little work."
Yeah, exactly. Well, so maybe I should give you a quick primer.
Yeah.
So the thing that Buddha understood was something that he called dependent origination. And it's pretty simple. It means no this, no that. No sunshine, no tree. No tree, no apple. No apple, no bees pollinating the tree. No birds eating the bees. You can take that out to the end of reality. You can take that out to the Earth's place in space. If we were any closer to the sun, water would burn off and we couldn't live. And if we were any farther away, water would freeze. And we're being held there by all the gravitational forces of the universe. So as much as it we have a self-awareness that your body and my body, if I shoot myself, you don't fall down. But that's only half the story, because we've never been disconnected from oxygen. We've never been disconnected from sunshine, from water, from microbes in the soil, from pollinating insects, to the people who grew the cotton, spun it, wove it, cut it into that shirt and shipped it to you. So we spend a lot of time thinking about ourself and what we want and our importance, but that self is well-rounded and half an inch in diameter.
Right.
And around the outside of it is the vastness of the universe. And
Yeah.
when people understand that there is no physical referent for the self inside us, there's nothing corresponding to an organ that we could ever identify. If you take an apple apart, there's nothing in there that you could call the germ of appleness. If you take your hand apart down to the skin, the ligaments, the blood vessels, you'll never find the essence of handness. All these things are kind of temporary constructs.
Right.
So there's a great freedom in that, because then once you understand that yourself, the thing you call I, me, mine, is simply awareness, you realize there is nothing broken in you that's not just a habit.
Right.
We're born, we're told what we're like. We get a little older, we imply what we're like by the way people react to us. And over time, we begin to solidify that notion of a self into some little thing behind our forehead or in our chest or wherever.
Right.
And we imagine that it's separate from the rest of the universe.
Right.
And that's the beginning of all our problems. Because if we're just this tiny little firefly twinkling around next to the immensity of the universe, we're pretty weak.
Right.
And it's pretty fearful. So
Yeah.
we began strategies to make ourselves self-important, to get rich, to get powerful, to be different.
And that's all based on what I've heard called the egocentric delusion.
Yeah,
The idea that objectively I may not be the center of the universe, but I might as well be, in terms of what I care about and what I pay attention to.
right. Well, we're groomed. I mean, I can't stress enough how much of that grooming of our attention is habitual. When we're little, every adult who talked to us was describing the world to us. What a cute little boy. What a nice cheek. Look at the birdie. Look at the tree. Look at the nice doggy. And because we have nothing to compare it to, by the time we're about 5 or 6, we can run that movie for ourselves. And that means we're fully initiated in the culture.
Right.
But
Right.
those cultural descriptions are arbitrary. There are people in the world who believe in witches and can die from being cursed. So once you understand that there's a much bigger reality around this thing we're calling the self, and that most of the things we consider problems are problems of the limited perceptions of the self, then there's an inducement to say, wow, so what does freedom look like? Suppose I wasn't jerked around by my mind. Suppose I could be in control of where I put my attention and what I did with it. And Buddha offered us practices to quiet the mind. He offered us practices to develop our concentration. And he offered us an ethical framework so we didn't hurt people with the power that we developed.
Now, what is this dependent origination? That's related to the concept of emptiness, which I think is, so easily misunderstood by people. What is that? The emptiness is the ephemerality of the self, that there is no there.
Well, where emptiness comes from, it's a hard word for Westerners because we think it means nothingness.
Mhm.
But what it means is if your self or your idea of yourself is dependent on all these other things in the world, there actually is no self. So
Right.
we say that despite our delusions, we are, and each thing is empty of self. And so emptiness is a kind of description of the pregnant energy of the universe, which is always turning into forms. It's like total formlessness, but it's not nothing. It's like an energy, and anything you see, whether it's a hummingbird, or whether it's the tree outside your window, or yourself in the mirror, is an extrusion of that emptiness.
Right.
So it's the perfect antidote to egocentric delusion
Right.
when you realize that everybody's comes from that emptiness.
And another concept that kind of fits in here is the law of impermanence, that nothing, everything's always changing. Um, I think that's also a hard concept. It's for the ego to accept, because don't we, we want to just get it right and fix it and live happily ever after. We become enlightened, or we are in love, or whatever, and we imagine some fixed state of
Yeah.
euphoria. Yeah.
So when the Buddha was enlightened, he came back to talk to the 6 guys that he'd been practicing with for years. And he'd taken 49 days after his enlightenment to think, how am I going to teach this to people? How am I going to explain this? But he came back, and the first speech he gave was called the Four Noble Truths.
Right.
So the first one, the very first one, was dukkha. And Christian translators called that suffering.
Right.
And a lot of people got the idea that Buddhism is just life is suffering, and we want to get out of it as quickly
Right.
as
Right. Mm-hmm.
big mistake. The Buddha defined it in his first speech, his first teaching. He said, dukkha is being born, dying, being in physical pain, grief, being stuck in a situation you don't want to be stuck in, or being prevented from getting in a situation that you want to be in. And he called it a noble truth. So if truth means anything, it means real. And if noble means anything, it means worthy of respect and dignity. And what he was saying is, you're not spiritually deficient when you're afflicted. It's not your fault. This is what keeps the world moving. If you get cold, you get closer to the fire. If you get hot, you move away from the fire. Just you have to understand everything lives in a kind of peppered wind. It's what keeps everything changing.
And that's the first noble truth.
That's the first noble truth. The second one is called samudaya, and it means arising. And it means when we're afflicted, when a guy cuts us off in the car, feelings arise. And they're not your fault either. It's not, somebody takes your space or does something you don't like, something's going to arise. You don't have to act on it, but it's not your fault. It doesn't signal that you're, a numbnuts or spiritually undeveloped. The third noble truth is the first one you can do something with, and it's called nirodha. And what it means is containment. And what the word referred to was a clay wall around a fire pit that would stop a peasant's fire from leaping into the fields or burning down the village. And so what the Buddha taught us was that by meditating and by sitting still and by disciplining ourselves to follow our breathing and take some time off and not stimulate the mind, but let it relax, we could contain whatever arose in us. And the dilemma comes when we run away from what arises. Right. When we run away from strong feelings, we become an addict, we become an alcoholic, we spend too much, we wind up in the wrong bed, we make lots of trouble and a big mess. When we meditate, we can learn that we can control this, that it's not going to control us. It's like if I pour gasoline on the ground and light it, it's just a conflagration. If I put it in an engine block, it's contained and it does work.
Right.
So once we can contain it, then the last noble truth is called marga, and it's the eightfold path. It's you go through your life and you check in with yourself every time you make a decision. Am I acting according to Buddha's view of the world? Am I speaking kindly according to Buddha's speech? Are my actions helpful to others and kind? Am I doing the right thing for a livelihood? Am I making the right effort, right concentration? And what's the last one? I always forget, mindfulness. So there's no Buddhist cops. We have to do that for ourselves so that we train ourselves, because if our personality is not who we really are is that energy, that pregnant energy.
I've got a question about the second noble truth. You know, I've heard it, I've studied Buddhism for 50 years, and I've heard it translated as the cause of the suffering, the cause of dukkha is desire.
Yeah,
And I I have a problem with that. Now,
I did too.
I also, because if you don't have desire, nothing's going to happen. But craving is another word I've heard, which seems to make more sense, or, you know, this emotional attachment aspect. Um, Craving, addiction is another term that Ken Kai's used to use. So what is your take on the second noble truth?
Well, I always had trouble with the first translations of noble truths.
Right.
You know, suffering exists. There's a path to end that you can end suffering. There's a path to do it. It just, what are you talking about? I don't get it. So there's a guy named Dave Fraser. He wrote a book called The Feeling Buddha, and he went back to the Sanskrit terms of like dukkha, samudaya, nirodha, and marga, and relooked at them according to what Buddha meant. So if you're a parent, are you going to be unattached to your children? I mean, if you're a husband, are you going to be unattached to your family?
Right.
There's a kind of tautology in it, because if dukkha is birth, and if dukkha comes from craving, it means you had to have had a former life to crave being born. And the Buddha didn't actually teach that. That's, you know, a lot of the reincarnation stuff comes from Hinduism. And there are some sects of Buddhism, like Tibetan Buddhism, that concentrate much more on that.
Yeah.
Zen people don't. We're much more interested in what's going on right here, right now. But where the craving comes into it, or where you can do something, is when I was talking about the trigger. Something triggers you. Well, you cut off your attachment to that trigger. And that's when you look in, because the trigger will just distract you. I'll say, this guy got me so angry, he made me chase him and smash into his car. Well, don't be silly. So when we're afflicted, if we absolutely deny our thirst, that's another way it's been translated, thirst for experience, or thirst for revenge, or thirst to express ourselves, we can remember to look at ourselves and say, wait a minute, this murderous feeling is mine. That guy didn't put it in me. That guy was just the cause of it. So we could talk about thirst and craving and all of this stuff, but in terms of your actual life, if you meditate, you will learn that whatever comes up is ephemeral, and whatever comes up is Buddha nature. We're not trying to run away from it. And so at the point at which you realize that even your thoughts are expressions of Buddha nature, the emptiness of the universe,
Right.
you can just look in for any truth that you need, because your intuitions will guide you if you ask them.
Right. You know, I can't believe how fast the time was flying by. And I wanted to ask you about happiness, because you said something that I really found profound, which was, for many years I suffered from wanting to be happy. One day I gave up caring whether I was happy. And I guess that
Yeah.
made a difference.
Yeah, it made a big difference. I mean, I was always looking at why I was unhappy. I was studying it. I was looking at all the reasons. All I was concentrating on was my unhappiness. And I got a glimpse of like this well-rounded half-inch in diameter guy. What a
Right.
stupid thing to do on this splendid, brilliant planet in this starlight. And so I just said, well, screw it, you know. And as soon as I stopped caring and stopped looking every day about why I was unhappy, I'm pretty much happy most of the time.
Uh-huh. Wow. That's a beautiful lesson. You know, I heard of some other podcasters say um, the the way to become happy is to give up the pursuit of happiness. So it's kind of the
Yeah.
same idea.
I mean, the idea that happiness is outside of you,
Right.
it's like enlightenment. If you sit down and start to meditate and you think enlightenment is outside of you, or is a fence that you have to climb over to get to Buddha Disneyland, and everything is going to be just clear sailing. You're never going to put your idea of a self together with your idea of enlightenment. You're
Right.
already enlightened, is what the Buddha said.
Well,
And what's,
isn't that what the ego does? It just objectifies everything, is
yeah,
commodifies everything, you know? Um,
yeah. And we have this evolutionary inheritance of greed and anger and delusion, which clouds over our enlightenment. And
right,
one of the things that meditating does is it shows us the impermanence of those things. One last thing about impermanence, you have to realize that's where our freedom comes from. If the universe was fixed, we would have no choices. But because the universe is always changing, it's the source of our freedom. And so much as we might want to be stubborn and keep this situation just as it is, because this is the way I like things,
right,
that's just trying to take a photograph of a river.
right, right. Well, that's a good place for us to stop because we have run out of time and I have to close the show, but I hate to because this is we could talk for a long time. It's fascinating, endlessly fascinating for people like me and you and many of my listeners. We've done a lot of programming around Buddhism over the years. But thank you so much, Peter, for being on the show. It's been great hanging out with you and
Thanks
hearing
for
about your,
plugging my book, Paul. I appreciate it.
yeah, yeah. And I want to make sure to tell our listeners about your website, which is petercoyote.com/Zen in the vernacular. Zen dash in dash the dash vernacular. But I'm sure if they go to petercoyote.com, they'll find it.
That's all they need. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And they can go to Amazon and see I've written 5 books. Some of them may appeal to you.
Right, right, right. Yeah, some of them look fascinating. But for those who may have tuned in late today, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, author of Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. Now, don't worry, you can play and or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with Peter Coyote, author of Zen in the Vernacular, Things as It Is. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. Even better, podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com. That's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes, Paulo's YouTube channel, and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Peter Coyote and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.